October 14th, 1943. 25,000 feet above Germany. 291 Boeing B-17 flying fortresses push deep into hostile territory without fighter escort. Within hours, 60 bombers will be shot down. 600 American airmen dead. Another 650 wounded or missing. The second Schweinfurt raid becomes the bloodiest day in 8th Air Force history. The mathematics are brutal. At this casualty rate, no bomber crew will statistically survive their required 25 missions. Post-mission analysis reveals the grim truth. The B-17's defensive guns, the weapons that were supposed to make it a flying fortress, are failing catastrophically. Tail gunners achieve hit rates below 8%. German fighters attack from behind with near impunity, methodically destroying America's billion-dollar strategic bombing campaign one fortress at a time. But what military planners don't know is that 1,500 miles away, in an unlikely location, a solution is already taking shape. I'm John Donald, and you're watching John Donald, WW2 Records. If you want to discover the untold stories of World War II that changed the course of history through innovation and engineering, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This is the story of how a team of civilian mechanics in Cheyenne, Wyoming, revolutionized bomber defense. How they developed a modification that would be installed in nearly 6,000 B-17s. How their engineering saved thousands of American lives. And how the place that gave us this life-saving innovation has been largely forgotten by history. This is the story of the Cheyenne tail turret. To understand why the Cheyenne innovation proved revolutionary, you must first understand the impossible problem tail gunners faced in 1943. The B-17 flying fortress entered combat with a defensive philosophy borrowed from naval warfare. Bristling with machine guns creating overlapping fields of fire, the bombers would theoretically protect themselves through sheer volume of lead. Army Air Force promotional materials called it a flying battleship. Reality proved brutally different. The tail gunner station was barely larger than a coffin. The gunner knelt on a bicycle seat, feet braced against the aircraft structure, hands wrestling twin 84-pound Browning M2 machine guns through a cramped field of fire. His aiming system consisted of a ring and bead sight, 2 metal posts mounted outside the aircraft that he had to visually align with his target, like sights on a frontier rifle from 50 years earlier. To hit a diving fighter, the tail gunner had to estimate the target's speed relative to his own aircraft, calculate deflection angle, determining where to aim ahead of the moving target, compensate for bullet drop over distance, execute all these calculations while wearing bulky gloves in negative 40-degree temperatures, while under fire, while oxygen deprived at altitude. The ring and bead sight offered no help whatsoever. No compensation for speed. No calculation for deflection. Nothing. Expert gunners from peacetime aerial gunnery schools attempted the same shots under controlled conditions. Their hit rates barely exceeded 12%. In actual combat, stressed, oxygen deprived, and under fire, hit rates plummeted to between 6 and 8%. One study found that American bombers expended over 40,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition for every German fighter actually destroyed. The defensive armament wasn't working. The Luftwaffe recognized the B-17's tail gun vulnerability immediately. German fighter tactics evolved throughout 1943. Attack from 6 o'clock level or low. Accept 15 to 20 seconds of inaccurate tail gun fire, close to 200 yards, and unleash devastating 20mm cannon strikes. Luftwaffe after-action reports described B-17 tail positions as marginally dangerous, with accuracy insufficient to deter attacks. The losses mounted with terrifying speed. August 17, 1943. The first Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid. 60 bombers lost. October 8, Bremen raid. 30 bombers lost. October 10, Münster raid. 30 bombers lost. The 8th Air Force hemorrhaged bombers faster than factories could replace them. Then came Black Thursday. October 14, 1943. The second mission to Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories. 291 B-17s dispatched. 60 shot down. 17 damaged so severely they had to be scrapped. 121 returned with varying degrees of battle damage. 26% of the attacking force destroyed or written off. 650 crew members killed, wounded, or missing. 22% casualties. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, received the casualty reports in Washington. He immediately questioned whether daylight strategic bombing remained viable. The losses were unsustainable. At this rate, the entire strategic bombing campaign faced cancellation. Something had to change. The bombers needed better defensive weapons. The gunners needed better sights. But development and production timelines stretched into 1944 or beyond. Meanwhile, men continued to die. The solution wouldn't come from a laboratory or a defense contractor. It would come from an unlikely place: a commercial airline maintenance facility in Wyoming, Cheyenne, Wyoming, 1930 to 1940. Most Americans have never heard of Cheyenne's role in aviation history. But for a decade, this city in the high plains was known as the air capital of the West. United Airlines, formed in 1931 from the merger of Boeing Air Transport and several smaller carriers, established its primary maintenance hub in Cheyenne. The location made strategic sense. Cheyenne sat on the transcontinental airmail route between Chicago and San Francisco. The city's elevation, over 6,000 feet, provided ideal conditions for testing aircraft at altitude. United's mechanics developed an international reputation for innovation and problem-solving. They installed the first de-icing equipment on commercial aircraft. They pioneered wide-scale installation of variable-pitch propellers, cabin heaters, and air-to-ground radios. The facility became so renowned that aviation officials from Britain, France, Soviet Russia, and Nazi Germany sent observers to study their techniques. By 1941, United Airlines employed 1,400 workers at Cheyenne. The mechanics, many of whom had learned their skills repairing early transcontinental airmail planes, performed what one aviation historian called literally magician's work, keeping aircraft flying. When America entered World War II in December 1941, the military immediately recognized Cheyenne's potential. In late December, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, 2 Boeing B-17 bombers arrived at Cheyenne with classified instructions. Modify these planes to carry extra fuel and camera equipment for a special reconnaissance mission. The mechanics worked through Christmas. The modified B-17S provided aerial photography that helped plan Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's famous bombing raid on Tokyo in April 1942. The military wanted more. Much more. January 2, 1942. The Army Air Forces Materiel Command officially designated Cheyenne as Bomber Modification Center No. 10. The mission was straightforward but massive in scope. B-17 flying fortresses would arrive from Boeing factories in Seattle, Douglas plants in Long Beach, and Vega facilities in Burbank. These were green aircraft, flyable but incomplete. Cheyenne would install combat equipment that factories couldn't fit into their production schedules: guns, armor plating, communication equipment, navigation systems, oxygen systems, everything needed to transform factory-fresh bombers into combat-ready fortresses. The Cheyenne Airport expanded rapidly. 2 new hangars constructed in 1942, a third in 1943. By spring 1943, 1,600 workers labored around the clock. The operation achieved remarkable efficiency. 6 planes per day left Cheyenne for combat areas. Each aircraft spent an average of just a few days in the facility. Speed was critical. Every day a bomber sat in Cheyenne was a day it wasn't bombing Germany or Japan. Captain Ralph S. Johnson became the Modification Center's chief test pilot. His job was to flight test every single modified aircraft before it deployed to combat units. Johnson and his crews test flew approximately 10,000 aircraft during the war. B-17S, B-24 Liberators, P-BY Catalina flying boats. If it needed modifications, Cheyenne handled it. Johnson's test flights ensured that every modification worked properly, that aircraft handled correctly, that crews could depend on their equipment when their lives hung in the balance. The workers at Cheyenne, predominantly civilians with no military rank, took their responsibility seriously. They knew that sloppy work meant dead airmen. Every rivet, every bolt, every wire had to be perfect. Their reputation for precision and innovation grew. When the B-17 faced its crisis of defensive armament effectiveness in late 1943, Cheyenne's engineers were ready to provide the solution. The engineering team at United Airlines' Cheyenne facility faced a complex problem. B-17 tail gunners were dying because they couldn't aim effectively. The ring and bead sight was obsolete technology. utterly inadequate for high-speed aerial combat. But simply adding a reflector sight wasn't enough. The entire tailgun position needed reimagining. Reflector gun sights had existed since World War I. The technology was well understood. A light source projects an illuminated aiming reticle onto an angled glass reflector, creating an aiming point that appears to float at infinity in the gunner's field of view. The gunner sees both the target and the aiming mark simultaneously, making accurate tracking possible. Fighter aircraft used reflector sights with great success, but installing one in the cramped, confined B-17 tail position presented unique challenges. The existing tailgun mount, nicknamed the Stinger, severely restricted the gun's range of motion. The windows were small, limiting visibility. The ring and bead sight sat outside the aircraft, exposed to slipstream and easily damaged. Any improvement needed to address all these problems simultaneously. Greater gun elevation and traverse, larger windows for better visibility, a protected reflector sight inside the aircraft. And it all had to fit within the existing B-17 fuselage structure, without requiring complete redesign. Cheyenne's engineering team consisted of experienced aircraft mechanics, who understood both the theoretical and the practical. They had to design something that worked in theory, could be manufactured with available materials and tools, could be installed quickly to maintain production flow, and would function reliably in combat conditions at -40 degrees, at 25,000 feet altitude, under sustained fire. The engineers went to work. The result would be called the Cheyenne Tail Turret, and it would change everything. The Cheyenne Tail Turret, officially known as the Cheyenne Modification, represented a complete redesign of the B-17's tailgun position. The engineers replaced the cramped Stinger mount with what crews nicknamed the pumpkin installation, after its distinctive rounded shape. The modification provided dramatic improvements across every metric that mattered. First, much larger windows. The Cheyenne tail featured expansive plexiglass panels that gave the gunner significantly better all-around visibility. The old Stinger design created blind spots. The new pumpkin configuration let gunners track targets through a much wider field of view. Seeing the enemy was the first step to hitting the enemy. Second, greatly increased gun elevation and azimuth range. The twin 50 caliber machine guns could now traverse through a much wider arc, both horizontally and vertically. German fighters that once attacked from angles, the old mount couldn't cover now faced accurate defensive fire. The Luftwaffe's favorite tactic, attacking from slightly below the tail, became significantly more dangerous. Third, and most crucially, a reflector gun sight replaced the primitive ring and bead. The new sight mounted inside the aircraft, protected from damage and elements. It projected an illuminated reticle that the gunner could see clearly, even in poor lighting conditions. The sight was electrically powered, with a backup ring and bead in case of electrical failure. But when it worked, it transformed gunnery effectiveness. The reflector sight gave gunners an aiming point that accounted for bullet trajectory. While not as sophisticated as the computing gun sights in power turrets, which calculated lead and deflection automatically, the reflector sight was a quantum leap beyond the old ring and bead. Gunners could now track targets smoothly, maintain proper aim, and fire with confidence that their bullets would go where they aimed. The difference in combat effectiveness was immediate and dramatic. The development of the Cheyenne tail turret occurred in parallel with continuing B-17 production. Boeing, Douglas, and Vega continued building aircraft with the older Stinger tail mount through late 1943 and into early 1944. The factories couldn't pause production to implement design changes without causing massive delays. This is precisely why modification centers like Cheyenne existed. On February 15, 1944, the first B-17 received the Cheyenne tail installation at the Wyoming Modification Center. The aircraft was Boeing-built B-17G serial number 42-97261. Mechanics removed the old Stinger tail section and installed the new pumpkin configuration with its larger windows, improved gun mount, and reflector sight. After installation, Captain Ralph Johnson took the modified bomber aloft for thorough testing. The modification worked flawlessly. Production accelerated. United Airlines mechanics developed streamlined installation procedures. Remove old tail cap. Install new mounting structure. Fit larger window panels. Mount guns on improved traverse mechanism. Install reflector sight and electrical system. Test everything. The entire process took just hours when performed by experienced crews. Cheyenne's 6 aircraft per day throughput continued without interruption. By mid-1944, aircraft arriving at Cheyenne received the tail modification as standard procedure. Meanwhile, Boeing, Douglas, and Vega began incorporating the Cheyenne tail into their production lines. Boeing started with B-17G production block 80-BO in mid-1944. Douglas followed with Block 45DL. Vega implemented it with Block 55VE. From that point forward, virtually every new B-17G rolled off the assembly line with the Cheyenne tail already installed. The modification had become standard equipment. Between factory installations and Cheyenne modifications, thousands of B-17S eventually received the improved tail turret. The innovation developed in Wyoming became the standard configuration for America's most iconic bomber. The impact of improved tailgun sights on B-17 combat effectiveness cannot be precisely quantified, but operational evidence strongly suggests significant improvement. Gunners equipped with reflector sights reported much greater confidence in their ability to engage attacking fighters. The illuminated reticle made target tracking dramatically easier. The ability to see the aiming point clearly, even in poor visibility, meant more hits and fewer wasted rounds. German fighter tactics began shifting in mid to late 1944. Luftwaffe pilots, who had previously favored rear-quarter attacks on B-17 formations, increasingly adopted head-on attack profiles despite the greater danger. Why? Because improved tail defenses made rear attacks too costly. German after-action reports noted increased effectiveness of American tail gunners. What had been marginally dangerous became genuinely threatening. Studies of defensive armament effectiveness found that bomber gunners achieved higher hit rates with reflector sights compared to ring and bead configurations. While precise percentages varied based on combat conditions, crew training, and target presentation, the trend was clear and consistent. Better sights meant better shooting. Better shooting meant more German fighters shot down or driven off. More fighters driven off meant more bombers returning home safely. The Cheyenne tail turret contributed to this improvement. Combined with other factors, including the arrival of long-range P-51 Mustang escorts in early 1944, improved crew training, and better tactics, B-17 loss rates declined from the catastrophic levels of Black Thursday. By mid-1944, bomber crews had a reasonable expectation of surviving their 25-mission tour of duty. That expectation didn't exist in October 1943. How many lives did the Cheyenne tail turret save? Impossible to calculate exactly. But with 5,736 B-17S processed through the Cheyenne facility, and many thousands more receiving factory-installed Cheyenne tails, the modification touched a substantial portion of the B-17 force. Every percentage point improvement in defensive effectiveness translated to bombers saved and airmen who came home. While the Cheyenne tail turret represents the modification center's most famous contribution, it was far from the only innovation developed there. Between January 2, 1942, and July 31, 1945, Cheyenne Modification Center No. 10 processed 5,736 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses. Nearly half of all B-17S built during the war passed through this facility in Wyoming. Each aircraft received dozens of modifications and upgrades. Installation of nose guns for defense against head-on attacks. Armor plating to protect crew positions. Updated radio and navigation equipment. Oxygen systems modifications for high-altitude operations. Bomb rack configurations specific to different theaters of operation. Aircraft destined for Europe received different equipment than those heading to the Pacific. Cheyenne customized each bomber for its intended mission. The workforce at Cheyenne, peaking at 1,642 employees, included a remarkable number of women. Approximately half the employees were female, filling roles traditionally held by men who were now serving in uniform. These women became expert aircraft mechanics, electricians, sheet metal workers, and inspectors. They worked alongside male colleagues with equal skill and dedication. The Cheyenne facility proved that women could perform any job in aircraft maintenance when given proper training and opportunity. The Modification Center operated around the clock 7 days a week. Aircraft arrived continuously from factories. They moved through the modification process on a tight schedule. Test pilots flew each completed bomber to verify all systems functioned correctly. Then the aircraft departed for embarkation points, where they would be flown overseas to combat units. The flow never stopped. Every day of war meant more aircraft needed. Cheyenne delivered. The facility's efficiency and innovation earned recognition throughout the Army Air Forces. When complex problems arose, when new modifications needed development, officials looked to Cheyenne for solutions. The civilian workforce performed with military precision. The Cheyenne Modification Center didn't limit itself to tail turrets. United Airlines mechanics developed numerous other improvements that enhanced B-17 combat effectiveness. One significant modification involved the installation of cheek guns in the bomber's nose section. Early B-17 models lacked forward-firing defensive weapons, making head-on attacks by German fighters particularly deadly. Cheyenne engineers, led by designer W. W. Erickson of United Airlines, developed monocoque cheek gun installations that provided defensive fire against frontal attacks. The cheek guns, mounted in streamlined blisters on either side of the nose, gave bombardiers and navigators the ability to return fire during head-on attack runs. While the B-17G model eventually incorporated a powered chin turret under the nose, earlier G models and many F models received Cheyenne's cheek gun modification. This interim solution saved lives while Boeing developed the chin turret for production. Cheyenne mechanics also pioneered improvements to waist gun positions. Early B-17S had open waist positions, exposing gunners to frigid slipstream and providing no protection from enemy fire. Cheyenne developed enclosed waist gun installations with plexiglass windows and reflector sights, dramatically improving both gunner comfort and accuracy. These modifications spread throughout the B-17 fleet. The facility installed specialized equipment for different combat theaters. Aircraft heading to the Pacific received tropical climate modifications, additional survival equipment, and sometimes different defensive armament configurations. European theater aircraft received updated electronics for operating in the crowded airspace over England and coordinating with RAF systems. The modifications were never one-size-fits-all. United Airlines' expertise in commercial aviation proved invaluable for military applications. The company's mechanics understood reliability, efficiency, and the importance of every detail. They brought commercial airline maintenance standards to military aircraft modification, ensuring that bombers leaving Cheyenne would function reliably under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Their work saved countless lives. Captain Ralph S. Johnson's role as chief test pilot placed him at the center of Cheyenne's operations. Every modified aircraft had to pass his inspection before deploying to combat. Johnson flew B-17S with partially installed equipment, testing modifications under realistic conditions. He flew B-24 Liberators with new armament configurations. He flew PBY Catalinas equipped for long-range maritime patrol. Over the course of the war, Johnson and his test pilot crews flew approximately 10,000 aircraft. Johnson's test flights weren't just verification checks. They identified problems that ground testing missed. Equipment that worked fine on the ground sometimes failed at altitude. Modifications that seemed sound in theory sometimes created unexpected handling issues. Johnson's reports sent many aircraft back to the modification hangars for adjustments before they ever reached combat units. His thoroughness prevented equipment failures that could have killed aircrews. The mechanics and engineers who actually performed the modifications remained largely anonymous. Unlike the bomber crews who flew these aircraft into combat, whose names and stories filled newspapers and magazines, the civilian workers at Cheyenne received little public recognition. Security concerns prevented publicizing the modification center's location and activities during the war. Most Americans never knew Cheyenne existed, but the men and women working in those hangars knew the importance of their work. They saw the combat damage on aircraft that returned for repairs. They heard stories from ferry pilots about the desperate fighting over Germany. They understood that every rivet improperly set, every wire improperly connected, every modification imperfectly installed, could mean dead airmen. They worked with the knowledge that lives depended on their skill. Many of these workers were too old for military service. Others had essential skills that kept them in war production rather than uniform. The women workers took pride in filling roles that supported the war effort, while their husbands, brothers, and sons served overseas. Together, this unlikely team of airline mechanics became vital contributors to Allied victory. As World War II progressed toward victory in Europe, the demand for bomber modifications gradually decreased. By early 1945, B-17 production itself began winding down. The last B-17S rolled off production lines in April 1945. Germany surrendered May 8, 1945. The Cheyenne Modification Center processed its final aircraft July 31, 1945. In 3 years and 7 months of operation, Cheyenne Modification Center No. 10 had processed 5,736 B-17 flying fortresses, nearly 45% of all B-17S built during the war. The facility had employed over 1,600 workers at its peak. It had developed innovations, including the famous Cheyenne tail turret, that became standard equipment on American bombers. It had proven that civilian expertise could make vital contributions to military operations. After the war ended, most of the Modification Center facilities were turned over to the Wyoming Air National Guard. The former Boeing and United Airlines headquarters building became Cheyenne's Airport Administration Building. United Airlines maintained a presence in Cheyenne, operating a stewardess training school at the airport until approximately 1956. But the massive wartime operation ended. The workers who had spent the war years modifying bombers returned to peacetime lives. Captain Ralph Johnson, who had test-flown 10,000 military aircraft, continued his aviation career. The mechanics and engineers took their skills to other jobs in aviation and manufacturing. Many who had been too old for military service felt they had served their country nonetheless. They had. The contribution of Cheyenne, Wyoming, to the Allied victory gradually faded from public memory. Unlike the dramatic stories of bomber crews over Germany or fighter pilots in aerial combat, the story of civilian mechanics improving aircraft didn't capture popular imagination. History books focused on battles, not modification centers. But the impact was real and measurable. Thousands of American airmen came home because innovations developed in Wyoming made their bombers more effective and more survivable. In the decades following World War II, efforts to preserve the history of Cheyenne's aviation contribution struggled against time and changing priorities. The original United Airlines terminal building, constructed in 1929, survived and in 1985 was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. One of the original modification hangars, built in 1930, also received historic designation. An Art Deco fountain built in 1934 remains as a memorial to early aviation history. A historical marker erected outside the terminal building tells part of the story. It describes how Cheyenne became a center for United Airlines maintenance operations in the 1930s. It explains the modification center's role during World War II, processing 5,736 B-17s between January 1942 and July 1945. It notes that Cheyenne mechanics modified 2 B-17S for the reconnaissance mission supporting the Doolittle raid. And it specifically mentions the Cheyenne tail turret invention. The marker states that United Airlines mechanics at Cheyenne developed a modified tailgun arrangement giving the twin 50-caliber machine guns greatly increased elevation and azimuth range, while replacing the old ring and bead sight with a new reflector sight inside the window. It notes that the Cheyenne or pumpkin installation also improved all-round visibility by using larger windows. These few sentences preserve the essential facts of an innovation that saved countless lives. Aviation historians and B-17 enthusiasts understand the significance of the Cheyenne Modification Center. Books about B-17 production mention Cheyenne alongside other modification facilities. Online forums dedicated to World War II aviation discuss the Cheyenne tail turret's technical details. Researchers studying bomber defensive armament effectiveness include the Cheyenne innovations in their analysis. The story survives in specialized circles, but general public awareness remains limited. Ask random Americans about World War II contributions from Wyoming, and few would mention Cheyenne's Modification Center. The story deserves wider recognition. The Cheyenne tail turret represents more than just an engineering improvement to an aircraft weapon system. It represents what America accomplished during World War II through the combination of military determination and civilian innovation. It demonstrates how people far from battlefields contributed directly to victory and to saving lives. The civilian workers at United Airlines Modification Center No. 10 never fired a shot in anger. They never flew a combat mission. They never faced German fighters or flak over Berlin. But they helped defeat Nazi Germany as surely as the bomber crews who did. Every B-17 that returned safely because a tail gunner could aim more accurately, every German fighter driven off by improved defensive fire, every airman who survived his 25th mission and came home, owed something to the mechanics in Cheyenne, Wyoming. The United States produced over 300,000 aircraft during World War II. This industrial miracle required not just factories building planes, but modification centers improving them, maintenance depots repairing them, and testing facilities ensuring they worked correctly. Cheyenne was part of this vast system. A small city on the high plains became critical to American air power. The people who worked there, civilian airline mechanics with no military rank, became unsung heroes of the war effort. Today, the Cheyenne Regional Airport occupies the same location as the Wartime Modification Center. The terminal building still stands, housing the Wyoming Department of Transportation Aeronautics Division. One original hangar remains. The fountain memorializes early aviation. But the massive wartime operation, the 1,600 workers, the 6 aircraft modified per day, the testing, the innovation, all that exists primarily in historical records and fading memories. If this story moved you, subscribe to John Donald. World War II Records. Share this video so the contribution of Cheyenne, Wyoming to World War II victory is not forgotten. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. The men and women who modified 5,736 B-17 flying fortresses deserve to be remembered. Their innovation saved thousands of American lives. They helped win a war, and you just helped make sure they won't be forgotten.